Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 1708, and it is titled The Political Philosophy of Socialism. And it is written by Morris Hillquit. And copyright is 1930-something, I believe. 1931 is the copyright date. And this will be the ideas and views on socialism from the early part of the last century. So the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s. Alrighty, here we go. The political philosophy of socialism. The basis of political philosophy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. For more than 1.5 centuries, this eloquent preamble to our Declaration of Independence has been recited in schools and countless patriotic gatherings throughout the length and breadth of the United States. Generations of Americans have come to accept it as the revelation of an eternal verity, good for all times. And yet the immortal work of Thomas Jefferson was only the statement of a political philosophy of a historical period, inspired by the industrial conditions and needs of the time. The self-evident truths which it proclaims seemed dangerous fallacies to the people of an earlier generation, and may appear questionable in fact, and inadequate to principle, and, rephrase that, may appear questionable in fact, and inadequate in principle to the present and future generations. The American Declaration of Independence, like its equally stirring contemporary, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, is the political expression of an emancipation of industrial society from the economic fetters of feudalism. Government is instituted to secure to men the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, proclaims our Declaration. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the rights of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, announces the more sober and direct French document. The principle embodied in both declarations, the political supremacy of the individual, was revolutionary in its time. Today, it is beginning to hamper social progress and becoming reactionary. Sometime in the near future, a Declaration of Human Independence may take the place of the Declaration of Independence, and a Declaration of the Rights of Society may supersede the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Political philosophies always have been the sublimated expression of the changing industrial conditions and needs of the time. This can be best illustrated by a comparison of the systems of political philosophy prevailing in the feudal and industrial eras, presenting the past and the present, and the philosophy of socialism projecting itself into the future. Next chapter. The Feudal Order. The system of feudalism, which succeeded the earlier period of European chaos, turbulence, and general disorder, was founded on the economic basis of agriculture. In the earlier phases of feudal society, the cultivator of the soil was in constant danger of pillage and destruction at the hands of hostile, marauding hordes. He could not work without armed protection of his field. The man with the sword was as essential to agriculture as the man with the plow. The first division of labor was formed on these lines. Generally, and through the process of hereditary transmission of social functions, the division of labor ripened into fixed class differences. The warriors, through the monopoly of arms, became the rulers. They appropriated the land, the sole source and form of wealth, and became the class of land-owning nobility. The tillers of the soil fell into economic and political dependence. They became the villeins, or peasants. The exigencies of unremitted and unregulated warfare caused the nobles to seek ever wider military alliances, which made up for the complex political structure of medieval society and culminated in the kingdom as the supreme military unit and the king as the chief commander of all armed forces. At this stage, war was still a normal industry, and the military noble performed a necessary social function in the protection of the life and labor of the workers on his estate. He enacted tribute from his dependents, and in turn he undertook to render service and to make payment to his overlord. Feudal society was organized on military lines. Authority, discipline, and obedience were its cornerstones. Its economic basis was land, immovable property. Each noble owned and was dependent on a fixed area of land, his estate. The cultivators of the land were attached to it as permanent appurtenances, appurtenances. The social order was rigid and frozen. The political philosophy of the period faithfully reflects these social and economic conditions. It is very simple and is based on the theory of the divine right of the absolute monarch. The privileged position of the hereditary noble and the duty of obedience on the part of the people. Service is the keynote of feudal political philosophy, as liberty is that of the industrial age. The foundations of feudal society were shattered by the gradual pacification of Europe and the development of manufacture and trade, which received a powerful impulse in the rise of towns, the invention of printing, the discovery of a sea route to India, and of America. The nobility was stripped of its useful social functions as the military protector of the community and henceforward maintained its position as a privileged and parasitic class of landowners by control of the machinery of government, force of tradition, and social inertia. The development of industry and commerce as a rival to agriculture culminated in the spectacular economic transformation of Europe, generally known as the Industrial Revolution. Next chapter. The Industrial Revolution. The essence of the Industrial Revolution, which covers approximately the period of the 18th century, was the change of static local agricultural communities into an independent industrial world with national and, to some extent, international markets. It affected the whole Western civilization, but its classical development occurred in England, which was particularly favored by its geographical location, its trading connections, and at a later stage by the abundance of coal fields. The new era was ushered in by a series of epoch-making inventions in the textile industry, of which the most notable landmarks are the Kay Flying Shuttle in 1733, the Arkwright spinning frame in 1769, the Hargreaves spinning jenny in 1770, and the Compton mule in 1779. The Whitney saw gin, invented in 1793, made raw cotton exportable, thus giving a powerful impulse to the cotton industry in England. Cotton raising in the United States, incidentally to the extension of slavery. Raising in the United States and incidentally to the extension of slavery. 1769 marks the stupendous invention by Watt for the application of steam power to industrial uses. The foundation of the modern industrial era was thus laid. The hand tool was fast replaced by the machine. Mills and factories sprang up, calling for large forces of workers and causing an exodus from the villages, towns, and cities grew in numbers and size. A new class of wealth and power was created, the manufacturing and trading middle class. The industrial system differed from that of feudalism in every essential. Feudal wealth consists of immovable real estate. Feudal economy is based on agriculture, and the interest of the feudal lord demand a steady population of workers permanently attached to his estate. Feudal property is non-consumable and non-alienable. The estate is entailed for the benefit of the heir. Feudal work is localized and largely compulsory. The main characteristic of industrial society, on the other hand, is its mobility. Its wealth consists of personal property in a constant process of production, distribution, consumption, and reproduction. New industries spring up continually, and according to their peculiar character require different locations with a view of motive power, faculties of transportation, and other considerations. The growing and changing demands of industry call for a large and mobile army of workers, capable of being shifted from place to place and from industry to industry. The rights of free competition, free hiring of labor, and the absolute ownership and free disposal of personal property are the essential elements of industrial society. They are at the bottom of the political struggles between the rising class of manufacturers and traders and the privileged classes of the nobility and clergy, which represented the rigid and authoritative principles of feudal society. And we'll take a break for a sip, because I'm cottonmouth. Okay, new chapter. The Philosophy of Individualism. In this struggle, the economic interests and needs of the rising class of industrialists are translated into political and ethical slogans and concepts. The demand for the unrestricted right to manufacture and trade, to compete freely in the market, and to dispose of personal property is cloaked under the high-sounding watchwords of personal liberty and the inalienable right of property. The right to hire and fire workers according to the varying needs of industry is translated into the formula of freedom of contract. The need of a mobile army of workers, free to leave the land and go from place to place, and to change masters and occupations, leads to the concept of political freedom and equality. Opposition to the rule of the absolute monarchy and the economic privileges of the nobility and clergy, with all their hampering restriction upon the free expansion of industry and trade, finds expression in the demand for political democracy, as exemplified in representative government. Thus, a new economic class and new industrial needs give rise to a new social and political philosophy, the philosophy of individualism. This philosophy develops gradually in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, keeping step with the industrial transformation. In England, it is reflected in the first timid approaches of Thomas Hobbes, followed by the more definite and bolder theories of John Locke, and culminating with the complete systems of Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and others. In France, it is represented by the brilliant group of publicists known as the Encyclopedists, and particularly by the philosophic and political writings of Charles Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It was the latter's famous Social Contract, published in 1762, which summed up and crystallized the political philosophy of the rising bourgeoisie, the class of manufacturers and traders. According to this philosophy, man originally lived in a state of nature in which each individual enjoyed a full and unrestricted measure of personal liberty, but in turn could only rely on himself for protection. At a later point of development, a condition is reached in which man can no longer safely maintain himself in a purely individual existence. The primitive state can no longer exist, and mankind would perish if it did not change its way of life. At this stage, individuals are instinctively driven into associations for cooperation and mutual protection. They enter into an association on the basis of an agreement or contract, implied of not expressed, by which each individual voluntarily gives up their exercise of so much of his personal liberty as may be infringed on the similar liberty of his fellow man. In return for this, he receives the benefits and protection of the association. The association so formed is the state. The association so formed is the state. The powers ceded to it by its individual members constitute its sovereignty. The members of the association collectively become the people, and its relation to each other, the citizens. The theory of the social contract thus at once defines the limits and functions and character of government. The government is the chosen management of an association of equals, a representative government, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed, as our Declaration of Independence phrases it. These powers are delegated by the members of the association or citizens, hence they are limited. The individual is supreme. His rights and liberties are absolute, except to the extent that he has voluntarily transferred them to the government. Government, so conceived, is a sort of necessary evil to be kept down to the lowest possible point of function. The government governs best, which governs least, is the favorite phrase which tersely summarizes the views of the time. The philosophic conception of the function of government is reinforced by the economic theories of the great founder of the bourgeoisie school of classical economics, Adam Smith, and by his numerous followers. Their philosophy, generally characterized by the French phrase laissez-faire, leave it alone, advocates complete non-interference by government in business, absolute freedom of competition, production, and trade, and opposition to any regulation of relations between employers and workers. Producers and consumers are their economic Bible. For all correction of any maladjustments in economic relations, they rely on the infallible and curative effect of the interplay between supply and demand. It was on the basis of this philosophy and program that the young industrial and trading classes fought and won their political battles against the feudal order. The great French Revolution of 1789 was the most dramatic expression of this victory. In the United States, the character of the struggle was somewhat obscured and modified by the War of Independence, although it is quite obvious that the war was waged not merely for the national political freedom of the colonies, but also, and in the first instance, for the industrial independence of the rising American middle classes from the economic fetters of the British rule. The whole political ideology underlying the writings of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and other spiritual leaders of the American War of the Revolution, our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights, are inspired by the philosophy of the social contract. In England and in other advanced countries of Europe, the political transformation was accomplished less spectacularly, but not less effectively. By the beginning of the 19th century, the capitalist classes were politically enthroned in the civilized world. Next chapter, the capitalist revolution. But economic development did not stop with the political victory of the bourgeoisie. The 19th century witnessed an industrial revolution as radical and thoroughgoing as that of the preceding century. The evolution from small manufacture to large-scale production and the advent of trustified industry and banking capital, the introduction of metal-made machinery in the early part of the century in place of the wooden machines previously in use opened up a new era of invention, of labor-saving devices, culminating in the iron colossus of the modern factory. The first steam railroad was built in 1825. Its rapid spread soon covered the civilized part of the globe with a closely woven network of railroads. The slow wooden sailboats of the earlier part of the last century were replaced by iron steamships of ever-growing size, comfort, and speed, defying the oceans and bridging the continents. I think I missed a page there. Yep, I did. The greatest of all human discoveries, the use of electricity as a generator of light, heat, and motion, gave an undreamed-of impulse to production and industry. The telegraph and telephone, submarine, cables, and wireless communications broke down frontiers between countries and continents, and united the whole world into one industrial and commercial community. The modest factories of the early industrial era grew into the giant workplaces of modern times. Business communities expanded into million-headed cities. Manufacture and trade reached colossal dimensions and assumed a worldwide extension. The individual producer and merchant, the founder, promoter, and manager of his establishment was gradually superseded by the impersonal corporation, and the corporation was in turn merged in the trust or holding company, completely dominated and directed by the all-pervading banking capital. And I think we'll stop there for part one. of The Political Philosophy of Socialism, written by Morris Hillquit. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in part 2.